us a 1-minute overview of The World Turned Upside Down? Fascinating story.
So yeah, it focuses on the siege of Yorktown, which is the last major conflict in the American Revolution. And Yorktown, you could argue, is one of the crucial events in all of American history because it truly did turn the world upside down. Because as a result of Yorktown and this defeat of the British, the Americans defeated the British in Yorktown, Virginia, which is a small town south of us. We're in Virginia now. As a result of that, America became a free country, and it started on its path to where it is today in the world. So it was a siege because the British were entrenched at Yorktown, and the Americans and the French, they were allied with the French. There were French forces in America as well. They surrounded them, and with the help of the French Navy, they bombarded the town, and the British eventually had to surrender. And there was a big surrender ceremony.
So in addition to the fighting at Yorktown and the other skirmishes that might have occurred, does this book have any other themes?
I would say the theme of this book is freedom. But the interesting thing is freedom means different things to the different characters. So for James, it's very personal. It's about personal freedom. For George Washington and the other military leaders and the patriot leaders, it's really about freedom of a people to govern their own affairs.
One of the things that this book, which you just pointed out, it conveys several different perspectives. You don't just tell the American perspective from the winning of a war. And can you tell me how you made the decision to incorporate the different perspectives in this story?
Because I'm a trained historian, I'm very sensitive to, and I try to talk about multiple perspectives in any story, because any story is made up of multiple perspectives. And so a lot of books about Yorktown just talk about the military strategy and from the American standpoint, but I thought it's important to know what the motivations of the British were, what the agenda of the French was. They all have motivations and agendas and parameters that they're working within, and conflicts within relationships. You know, we're all humans. Yeah. They're all humans, all these characters, because they're real people. And so it's important to have that context.
And curious to know that there is a perspective missing, and that would be of women. Can you tell me a little bit more about how or why we don't really see that?
Women just were not leaving a lot of records, written records. The main sources you try to use are not just documents, but maps and oral history sometimes. But there's just no written records and no sources to work from
that
involve women. So I couldn't have a major character who was a woman. It's just the source is not there. So I do make a note of that in the author's note. I think it's important that students realize why it's not left out on purpose.
It's not intentional.
Right.
Right.
So this book is really about freedom. But as I like to say, freedom means different things to different characters.
So with James in particular, I believe I read a letter that Lafayette had written where it included that his servant had basically infiltrated the camp of Cornwallis and reported back to Lafayette. Can you tell me how that played into the Yorktown event?
So, my books are based on primary sources, so that's reliant on what is left from the past, and not everything survives from the past. And so a lot of enslaved people did not leave written records or documents about their experiences. And so that's, first of all, hard to tell that story. Second of all, of course, spies certainly do not leave a record, and they don't want to leave any trace of who they are, usually. And so that was doubly hard to find his story. And so there were two major documents, and one you're referring to was after the Revolutionary War. James was sadly still enslaved, and he was trying to gain his freedom. And so he submitted a letter, an application to the Virginia legislature saying why he should be free. And to supplement that, he asked for his boss, I guess you could say General Lafayette, to write a letter of recommendation. And so that exists, that letter exists.
I think you put a little excerpt of that
Yes.
in the text, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Lafayette had no power to free James.
Right.
It was very complicated, as history is.
Yes.
Who served as a spy for General Lafayette during the Revolutionary War, and I thought I'd never heard of this story. And it's fascinating to think of an enslaved man being a spy and putting his life on the line in that context during the war. And why would he do that? How did he do that?
Yeah.
Just got my curiosity juices flowing.
I must say that was one of the most interesting things for me, is learning. And I must honestly say, in all of my reading, this was the first time I really read about how involved James was, as well as the recruitment or potential recruitment of enslaved blacks during that time. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, what was, was that something that you were surprised to learn, or had you already known that?
You mean as a spy?
No, just like that they were being recruited by the British, that blacks were also being recruited to be emancipated by the British, and a lot of them took that up.
Right.
But then
So the British, once they invaded Virginia, and early on, the royal governor of Virginia also said any enslaved people would be free if they came to the British side. So he was trying to entice them to run to the British. And but then the British eventually left, and there were several years when the British were not in Virginia, but when they returned, the same thing happened. And so a lot of enslaved people began to equate the Union Jack, which was the British flag, with freedom. But there was no guarantee of freedom at all, and the British had to figure out how to care for these people. They had thousands of people following them, and while they were free technically, they could be recaptured if they left the British. So they had to be with the British. And then, if the British would leave, what would happen to them? Would the British take them? It was still an uncertain existence. And so there were no guarantees, and it was not suddenly they were free and life was great, by any means.
So James, this is the servant who, like you said, you're not certain how he became working for Cornwallis or even for Lafayette, but very wonderful.
It's amazing that there is a portrait of someone who was enslaved, because that's very rare. And it's a color portrait that exists today in a museum in Richmond, Virginia. And I don't always have images of the characters that I write about. In my last book, Star Spangled, there was a main character, Thomas Kemp, who we couldn't find an image of him.
Wow.
So students have to use their imaginations to decide what he looked like in their mind. But in this case, we do know
have the
what he
image,
looked
which was
like.
really great. So there are probably a lot of pieces that we don't necessarily know. It's not the whole story from beginning to end.
Right.
There's some gaps, right?
So yeah, in James's story, which I try to weave throughout this book, we don't know the first time that James met General Lafayette. We don't know if he had the idea to be a spy or if Lafayette had the idea. I'm guessing, I kind of write it as Lafayette did, because Lafayette was closely tied to George Washington, and George Washington had worked with spies. He established a spy ring in the North, in New York. He understood the value of a spy network in getting information you don't have, that you need. Lafayette didn't have a big cavalry, which is the people on the horses. So the cavalry often brings in the intelligence, and he didn't have that. So he needed someone to be the eyes and ears in the British camp. So one of the questions we have about James is, did he serve as a double agent? Did he ended up, we think, working for General Cornwallis, who was a British general. What was his capacity with Cornwallis?
Right.
We don't know, unless further evidence appears someday, which it could.
Right. Well, that was fascinating to me, and I really, like I said, the first time I learned it was in reading this book. Is there a favorite story that you have from this, all the research that you did?
There's lots of fun stories. Like I said before, there's a lot of, I talk a lot about spies and different ways that spies worked during the American Revolution. There were spies on both sides doing their jobs. I think my favorite chapter is called The Big Secret, and that is because it was so the French and the American troops mostly were in around New York City because the British had taken over and occupied New York City. The British were also in Virginia, but they made a decision. Washington ultimately made the decision with the French leader to try to surprise the British in Virginia, but that required a 500-mile march south. So they wanted to make the British think that they were going to attack New York City, but they're really attacking Virginia. But to do that, like I said, they had to make this journey south. And how do you keep that secret? It had to be a surprise because they wanted to surround General Cornwallis. And so they're not hopping on planes and coming down here. So it's a long logistical, it's like a big puzzle. I like to compare it to a puzzle. They had to put the pieces in the correct order for it to work. And the story you might be referring to is to keep it secret, they had tried all these different methods to fool the British into thinking they were going for New York. My favorite, I think, is the French were known for their love of bread. And so often the French army would build bread ovens wherever they encamped for a certain period of time. And so they wanted to make the British think that the French army was going to encamp for a long period of time, so they built these fake bread ovens and went around to the local merchants asking about supplies for flour and different things to really fool the British into thinking that they were staying there.
That was my favorite. That was my favorite story because, I mean, in addition to everything else, the fact that they were baking bread to fool them, to make them think that the French were coming, because who doesn't love a French baguette?
Right. So the other interesting thing to me that they had to keep secret is the fact that it was about 7,000 troops, French and American, that were marching. And so they had to get to a certain point, if you know your geography, they had to get to Philadelphia roughly before the British caught on to beat the British. Otherwise the British could have sent ships and somehow the surprise would not have worked. And so how do you keep the footprint that 7,000 people leave on the land when you have British spies marching all over the place looking for any movement?
Right.
It's just amazing to me that they could keep it a secret.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I mean, I think it was, we mentioned before, the idea of the mail being taken and the fake boats being built, and all of those things kind of help make that possible because they had to pass New York to get to Philadelphia, which is
right. And speaking of the mail, let me say one of my favorite primary sources in this book is a letter that George Washington wrote to his dentist about getting supplies for his teeth. His dentist was in Philadelphia. I don't know if you remember that letter.
I do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's amazing to me, first of all, that the letter still exists because it was confiscated by the British. It was intercepted in the mail. Mm-hmm. And the British then did that quite often. Both sides would plant letters, fake letters, and try to get some mail intercepted at times. Often they didn't want the mail intercepted, but sometimes they would plant mail that was fake. So the British would have to determine the authenticity of the letter. Was it a real letter or was it fake? But they determined that this was a real letter to his dentist, and that told them that Washington wasn't going south to Philadelphia anytime soon.
Right, because he was going to stop. He wasn't.
But it was a real
right.
letter. It was a real letter to him at the time.
Ah, yeah, sounds good. That's good.
So that's a really fun source because everyone can relate to their dentist.
The dentist,
right?
Yes. Can I ask you, how is it that you're so interested in history in particular? Like, has that been a lifelong interest in American history in particular?
What interests me about history, I think, is that what we do today, what our culture is today, is based on decisions people made in the past. And we might not know who those people were. We didn't know them 100 years ago. But they're making decisions like we make decisions every day, and it's going to impact the future generations. So I'm just fascinated by that fact. And for some reason, as a young child, I loved reading not about the future, but about stories from the past, because I knew even as a child that these things really happened. It's real life, and I was fascinated by the way people dressed differently in the 18th century, and people traveled, transportation was different, everything, it was like a foreign world in the 18th century, but it was still this area where we are.
Right.
I was fortunate that I grew up in a place that is near a lot of history sites where history happened, so there were museums to visit, like go to Philadelphia, go to Gettysburg, go to Williamsburg, go to Boston, and for some reason that made history come alive to me. It helped me, my imagination, to, if I could go to the place where it happened. So I'm a huge believer in taking children and students to historic sites.
Before reading this story, I really didn't know much about the geography of Virginia, and I'll say that in particular, I was surprised to learn that Virginia was the largest, I mean, I'm sure I learned it in elementary school, but that it was the largest of all the colonies, and so the most was at stake because of this particular threat by Cornwallis. Yeah.
Right, included what is today West Virginia, parts of Kentucky, I think even parts of western Pennsylvania. It's all
It's very large.
Virginia.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it stretched from the sea to the mountains.
Wow, which I didn't know.
Yeah.
It's really good. It makes a great statement with all the images. As you say, sometimes it was hard to find images for some of your research, but like in this particular case, I love this image of African-American soldier.
From the 1st Rhode
And he
Island.
was from the Rhode Island Regiment. Which,
So in this case, I tried to use images that are from the time period, but in this case, there were no images that I could find from the 1st Rhode Island. So this is the contemporary artist that specializes in soldiers
yeah,
and does amazing amounts of research.
to make sure he gets all the details right. And like this one too, which I thought was really beautiful.
That is amazing because that is from the time period. I think it was done by a French soldier, and historians think it's the first depiction of an African-American soldier here that they've found so
I
far.
thought that was great. There's so many, and the maps in particular, we have them here. I thought they were really helpful in helping me envision exactly how the troops were moving and where they were placed.
So the French had some amazing cartographers, map makers with them, and there's a whole collection of maps in the Library of Congress, and I included 1 or 2 of those in the book. I also include a British map that I found of Virginia showing where exactly they went, and you can see their notations of the generals on the map, and that's fun.
Wow.
But I love maps, but I thought you needed to have maps showing the different movement, and so I decided I needed 4 maps, and of course I looked for historic maps, and I looked for maps that are not too different from each other, they have the same look, and I just could not find something that worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up drawing my own maps, and so I drew these maps.
Oh, you did these.
Yeah, so it was
They are very
a
helpful.
fun aspect. It was a change from writing.
Have you done that in the past?
For my last book, for Star Spangled Banner,
okay.
Star Spangled, I did that.
Well, that was wonderful. What do you think my students will like about this book?
I think certainly spies. Who doesn't like a good spy story, right?
Yeah.
So there are spies throughout. Benedict Arnold, the traitor, who most people know about, he's in there because his story, when he switched from Americans to the British, is in this book because it was around the time that Washington first started meeting with the French leader, who was named General Rochambeau, and so it was it was a big embarrassment to Washington that one of his top leaders went over to the British.
So the one thing I would say is that I am not the person who would flock to reading, world history. If I read nonfiction, it might be biography. But with this particular book, it was very engaging. I found a lot for me to be interested in. You mentioned the spies, the story about James and him becoming, freed as a result of Lafayette, and I was intrigued the whole time. The story about the French bread really got me, and all the strategic things that I didn't think I'd be interested in, that Washington was employing to try to fool the British. All of this made me more engaged in reading it because this is not my type of book that I would normally flock to. So
I love to hear that.
yeah, it was really good.